that a little bit today. And I call that a kaleidoscopic tour through glimpses of 6 works in 3 decades from 3 countries. And I just wanted to dedicate this lecture to Julian Lesage, who's the co-editor of Jump Cut, a review of contemporary media, an online journal that used to be tabloid newsprint when I discovered it in the mid-1970s, and who always gave me wonderful critiques of my work when I published it there, and who really turned me on to some of the works we're talking about today, especially the first one. She wrote a very interesting article in the 1970s about feminist documentary, in which she discussed both self-health, that we saw a few days ago, and the film Rape, that we're going to just look at a tiny clip of today. And this article appeared in my own book, or was recycled in my own book in 1984. It's called Show Us Life. So I owe her a lot, and I just wanted to remember her. She's still kicking. She's in her late 70s, retired, but still editing, co-editing this journal. I urge you all to explore it if you don't already know it. Okay, so that's what we're going to do today. And I hope we have time to do the whole works. The 2 readings that I assigned for today by Judith Butler and some other obscure Canadian academic, we're going to return to in lecture 16 shortly. So I guess the readings for the Bad Girl Feminist Voices lecture are constituted by these 6 clips. Okay. And a lot of them are available on YouTube, and so if you want to look at the whole works, you will be my guest. Please help yourself to do that. The last 2 you cannot find on YouTube. I guess there's copyright vigilance going on, but if you do want to do that research on those 2 items, I can maybe make some suggestions for you. I don't know whether Romance, which is a feature film from France, ever played in India at any festivals. Anyone ever heard of this film? Catherine Breillat is a very important French director who's been active since the 70s, actually. And then my colleague, Marielle Nitoslavska, who's filmed Bad Girl on women's porn, a kind of survey around the year 2000 of women's porn, a very interesting film. Good luck in finding that. If anyone does want to research this, then I would perhaps be able to give you a link or something. Okay, I mentioned that the initial feminist reaction to the sexual revolution involved sexual violence, which they saw in both sexual assault, in rape, and in more abstractly, I suppose, or symbolically in pornography. So we're just going to look at glimpses from 1975 and 1981 of feminist documentaries on those 2 issues. The first film, Rape, is extremely interesting. It was shot on a primitive video camera, which was passed around a group, a circle, hand to hand. And so the visual quality is intentionally very low. It's the voices that are important. And Julian Lesage's point about this film is that it replicates perfect the structure of feminist consciousness raising. The voice, the shared voice, the listening, the circle, and it's really fascinating to see that. Joanne Elam adds an element of montage to this consciousness raising circle, which you will also see in this brief clip. And this is on YouTube, as I said. College? Can anyone just describe it? The last image we saw intercut was a photograph of a screw, correct? What is that? It's a comic visualization of what the woman has just said. Psychiatrists and police officers just think you want to have a screw, right? So it's like a comic, ironic appropriation of the key words in this public societal discourse about rape, right? What were the other images intercut? Did you notice? Everyone was like this. This consciousness raising session of rape survivors is in a very private space. but they've chosen to make it public through this cinematic work. But we also have intercut public spaces, street scenes, in which women are walking down the street as the women are discussing vulnerability in public spaces, right? So it's that those cuts serve as kinds of illustrations. And then to help us with our hearing, because remember, consciousness raising is very much about listening and hearing, keywords are repeated as intertitles, right? Like paranoid or you don't know whether you're going to come out of this alive. So it's a very interesting structure that's a little bit more complex than it seems. And we owe this archive a lot to preserve this film. Joanne Elam is dead. She has been, I think, for 10 years or so. And it's very important to have this 40-year-old, 42-year-old work available to us through an archive online to enable us to hear some of these voices as the feminist movement was discussing rape. And around this time, an important book came out called Against Our Wills by Susan Brownmiller, which really fed into this very focused discussion of rape. Any questions? Okay, let's move on to the next one, pornography. This next film what did we do? Okay. This next film, Not a Love Story, a film about pornography, is a Canadian film made in my hometown of Montreal at the National Film Board of Canada in 1981. The National Film Board does not, the National Film Board does not stream it because it's very aggressive and disturbing imagery. So fortunately, some pirate has uploaded it onto YouTube. Thank God for pirates. So we can actually see this important and very influential film. I love to hate this film. I think it was an important film in terms of summing up some of the feminist arguments of the anti-porn movement. But after we look at this clip, I'll maybe summarize my critique of the film, or maybe ask you what you think of this little clip. In the segment towards the end of the film we're going to look at, we encounter Robin Morgan, who's one of the very important feminist voices in this debate of the period, talking about porn. Then we visit a porn studio where the film's heroine, who is a go-go dancer, a stripper, who is going on this journey with the film director, Bonnie Sher Klein, in the world of pornography, raising her consciousness in a way. We see her pose for Hustler magazine centerfold. Do you all know what that is? So it was a very aggressive men's erotic magazine that was founded in the 1970s. One of the contradictory things about the scene is that the photographer who's photographing the centerfold is a woman. So we see Linda posing for the centerfold just to feel what it's like, and is a little bit perturbed by this process. But the whole thing is made to feel so contradictory by the gender of the photographer. And then a final little voice, a final voice, maybe summing up the anti-porn critique. So this is just like about 3 minutes of this film we're going to look at.
and you try to write your poetry and go on your marches and do all of these crazy insane things all at once. It's like making a real renaissance in the middle of insanity, Bosch world. But it is not impossible. I do not believe it is impossible. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Tom, I mean, thanks for showing that. I mean, I can't shake the feeling that this certainly is not connected intentionally, but it could be connected to the recent, not so recent controversy on Bernardo Bertolucci's Last Tango in Paris. the whole argument suddenly came out that the actress in there, she was roped into filming that very steamy sex scene involving butter as a lubricant and all that, and yeah.
So it really graphically shows the participation of women in this kind of image making and the contradictions around it and the perhaps involuntary contributions they're making or the manipulation of women in these filming situations. Yeah, I think that's true. And it highlights the issue of consent. Is Linda Lee consenting in this environment? Clearly, she volunteered to do this, but she doesn't have the confidence to stand up to this manipulative female photographer. So it's a very, very intricate scene. Any other question or comment? Okay, I think that one of the reasons I hate this film is that it's homophobic. The ideal nuclear family we just saw is a fake family. Robin Morgan was an outspoken lesbian activist. Her husband, Kenneth Pitchford, is an outspoken gay male poet. And I guess their kid sort of somehow, but you saw that the filmmaker had ushered the child into the frame to create this ideal heterosexual nuclear family, right? This infuriates me because the sexual orientation of many of the participants of the film is masked and therefore assumed to be heterosexual. This is a very narrow and specific critique I have. The larger critique is that it uses demagogic emotion to put across its message, images of suffering, for example, or affect to bolster its social and political arguments. Even worse, I think there's a kind of class divide. It interviews a few porn performers like Linda Lee who express their emotions. However, it also interviews these upper class feminist academics, whom we saw two of, who are allowed to express ideas and political analysis. There's a very insidious class divide going on in this film, in which the voices of women in the sex trade, in the porn trade, are not given the same weight, the same attention as the upper class feminist academics. It's a very simple point. I'm not the only person criticizing the film. It served its purpose in the day to highlight abuses of the porn industry, the prevalence, omnipresence of the porn industry, and historically we can identify certain flaws in the film. Any questions before we move on? Okay. So as I mentioned, Julia Lesage was very, very interested in feminist documentary, wrote about it constantly during the 70s and early 80s. Around the early 80s, there was a new phenomenon on the marketplace, MTV. I'm sure all of you assume it's been there forever, but in fact, it was invented in the early 80s. And Julia was also very interested in popular culture, and she thought, this new medium, MTV, is so full of contradictions that we can identify and we can privilege women's agency within this new medium. Like all pop culture, it's full of contradictions, and if we listen, we can hear women's voices speaking the truth. And I think her favorite film was, her famous music video from this time, I remember, I've never forgotten, was What's Love Got to Do With It by Tina Turner. This was #1 for weeks and weeks and weeks. Do you all know this song? You sort of? Okay, we're going to look at that now. Hear that now. because it reminds me of Julia. And see if you agree with her about the agency. Women's empowerment and agency and sexual desire. But Julia clearly preferred Tina Turner, a woman in her 40s who had survived a breakup and a bad marriage. And I think she just identified, a woman of color, I think she identified with this convergence of discourses and performances of agency. Any question? Okay, this next piece, I guarantee no one here has seen. This is an art video also from the US. A few years later, A Spy in the House That Ruth built. Ruth refers to Babe Ruth, the baseball star of the 1920s and 30s. You probably aren't too familiar with American baseball. It's a cousin of cricket, only worse. But this is a film about the woman artist's attraction to baseball players. And there's a very interesting article that another friend of mine, Jane Gaines, wrote about this video and the surrounding issues of feminist heterosexuality and its politically incorrect pleasures. And if any of you, there it is. If any of you are curious about this piece, I would be happy to share it with you. I get it free from my library, but I expect you would not be able to. So if anyone is interested, let me know. And we're only going to look at a tiny clip, but it again is about agency and desire. You could even say it's about lust, female heterosexual lust. And in the bad girl feminist movement, Gaines is correct that very often heterosexual attraction was silenced or downplayed or deemed politically incorrect. And she talks a lot in this article about the intersection of politics and sexuality and the whole notion of political correctness around sexuality. So we're just going to look at a little clip of this, and I hope the baseball references aren't too obscure for you. Just think of cricket.
The first year I discovered baseball was the summer I broke up with my boyfriend. It's interesting how things change. Now, the apartment is cozy, but then its minuscule proportions were a symbol of my various failures. That July,
Any comment or question about this? It's full of visual humor too, isn't it? The play with sexual symbols is really excessive and lots of fun, isn't it? That little coin pouch, for example. So it's not only very naughty as a film, but it's also very playful in an endearing way.
The title is very playful.
A Spy in the House That Ruth Built, yes. Okay. The next two works we're going to glimpse, unfortunately, are only trailers. Romance, Catherine Breillat, an art film director in France, really took things all the way. In this particular film, it's a little bit similar to A Spy in the House That Ruth Built, in that a woman who's unsatisfied with her marriage goes on the prowl for fulfillment, for sexual pleasure. And it's very bold. One of the sexual practices that the anti-porn movement critiqued and the anti-sex feminist movement critiqued in the 1970s was BDSM, power play around sadomasochism, for example. So this is one of the things that the heroine of this film discovers. And it really pushes the envelope as far as she can, keeping within the conventions of art cinema. It's a festival film that was a huge hit at the end of the century, and reminded everyone that this tireless feminist film director had been at work almost undercover since the 1970s. It is impossible to find on the internet, but this trailer is there, and this will just give you an idea. I think the title is ironic because romance is something that is not forthcoming in this film. It's a kind of co-opting fantasy of conventional heterosexuality, isn't it? Romance. If you, I had real trouble finding this trailer because whenever I Google romance, I get this wealth of films. You can see that on the right there about romance, like romance novels, romance films, romance television. But here is the trailer for the film. colleague at Concordia, Mariana Deslawska, which was a kind of survey of the emerging scene of the 1990s of feminist porn, both in Europe and North America. And again, this is only a trailer. Unfortunately, all I could find online is the overdubbed French language trailer, and I will translate for you after we look at it. Okay? This first person we see is Annie Sprinkle, known as a feminist porn star.
ঠিকই তো আছে, শুনছেন তো?
a one-page statement of your presentation, okay? So the previous day, that's tomorrow, right? So please hand us in a one-pager, either an artist statement or a statement indicating the clip you're going to use and the keywords or the headings of your argument. Okay? I'll just repeat that. The administration is insisting both that we keep a paper trail. So we'll use these one-page statements. They're worried that GN or some government body might audit the event. So we need to keep a paper trail with your one-page statements. But the grading will actually be based on the presentation in conjunction with the one-page statement. So we don't officially have a list of, or at least I don't, of who officially wants to be graded and who officially does not. I'm hoping there'll be as many presentations as possible. That's at 4 o'clock Saturday afternoon. Madhu and Rajani are having to leave before 4 o'clock on Saturday, so they are going to recruit someone to do the presentation for them. Okay? And if anyone else, is anyone else in that situation, leaving before Saturday evening? Everyone else is here. Good. Okay, so any questions about that? All right.
They're going to have the presentations. Whoever is going to have the presentation, they're going to present after the valedictory session is over.
Yes, the valedictory session hopefully won't be very long. It's going to be at 3:45 on the Saturday.
Yes.
And then I'll get my additional scarf, right? And then,
Do we get to wear the graduation hats?
yes.
He and the coordinator are to decide.
And then we'll get rid of the administrators and have our presentations, okay? Okay, lecture 16 is called, I just shared some information about the presentations. So you make sure you ask someone else what just was communicated, okay? You're doing a presentation?
I will try to see whether I can prepare it because I was so much.
Actually, all of us were working from an IT. We have such a lot of work right now. Direction of dance systems, etc. Like, it's very difficult to sit down.
So whatever you decide, you let us know.
I can maybe share some clippings from my PhD thesis, which is more about gender and sexuality issues. So maybe I can share some information with you.
That would be great. And so find out from the others what I just announced, okay? Okay, queer eruptions. I wanted to have a lecture focusing on the films we looked at yesterday, but in the from the point of view of these works as autobiographical works, filming the self. I mean, we're very familiar in 21st century culture with the selfie, but when these two films were made in 1975 and 1990 respectively, it was relatively innovative for these folks to be so frank about their own lives, their own voices, their own bodies, especially with respect to what I call the two most terrifying taboos in our culture, our human culture. I guess I'm talking about Western culture, sex and death. I don't know whether this would also apply to South Asian culture, probably, but it's an interesting question. So what interests me in Barbara Hammer's Women I Love, which is portrayed on the left, and in Silver Lake Life, in a way I'm glad we ended up showing Silver Lake Life even instead of his earlier film, because it makes a nice pair with the Barbara Hammer film. What interests me is how this autobiographical camera, the act of filming, as you see here in the mirror, or there, moments after the filmmaker has died, with the camera still in place that he's put there, how the camera performs identity, how the camera performs the life of the author. So that is why when I selected the reading by Judith Butler, I thought it might be interesting. I mean, those of you doing women's studies and feminism have already sampled her work. I thought it'd be interesting for the rest of you to at least confront her so that you can tell people in the market that you just read Judith Butler. Okay? She's obviously extremely difficult, very dense, and even if you come away from wrestling with this piece with 2 or 3 key terms and ideas, that's fine. But I wanted you to sample her, and her major concept of the performative is what I think really operates in these 2 works. The autobiographical camera operates like a kind of performative. The act of filming, I think, constructs the lives lived by Barbara Hammer and Tom Joslin. Any comment or question about the 2 films before we proceed? After having slept on those 2 films, which were, I think, quite bold compared to some of the other material we've looked at, do you have any fresh reflections on them? Okay. Here's a really simple statement. Both films have flowers in them, right? Although this is on the top, that's an artichoke that she has. You have artichokes here? Yeah, which she has trimmed to look like a flower. And the bottom in Silver Lake Life, immediately after the death and the removal of the body of the artist, we cut to this beautiful bright orange desert flower, correct? I think I would argue that flowers are key iconography in both films, but play very different roles. And I'm going to make you tell me, I'm going to sit here and make you tell me what the different roles that flowers play in these 2 films that you saw yesterday. So I'm waiting. Where's the mic? Okay, who's first? I can be very stubborn about this. So we'll just sit here for an hour.
The first film stars.
Give Neha the mic. No.
Hello. Yeah. So in the first film, the flowers are more about sexuality. It's a direct linkage between the female vagina and because this is also the sexual organ of the plant, the flower. So I think there's a coupling there between the flower and the female sexual organ. And so the first film, I think it talks about that. And the second film, actually, I can't really place that shot. I can't recall the shot where they cut.
Well, there's also that shot, and throughout, every once in a while, there's shots of flowers. There's also 2 tours of a cactus garden.
Yeah.
So there's this integration of natural plants into them.
I think since this film is about more about death, then I think this big, like I said, this is a representation of the reproductive organ of a female, right? Like this is the reproductive organ of plants, the flowers. So I think it has more to do with the whole cycle of life and death. Like I think in the second film, it is more to do with that than sexuality. But and the first film is about sexuality, representation. And very interestingly, the film that we saw on the documentary on the female reproductive organ, which was just like what was the name of that film? I just helped me out here.
Self-help.
Yeah, self-help. So in that film also, like it demonstrated how to like look into your vagina, how to the different parts of it, etc., etc. So here also, I think that there is an initiative to do that, to like kind of unconceal the female organ, to like talk about it, to bring it, and though it does it symbolically to the by using the flowers, I think there is that effort to unconceal, to reveal, like and to bring it to the forefront, like.
And do you think that this very strong emphasis on the flower as women's genitals tells us something about gender, or the artist's view of gender? I mean, we
I
have.
don't think I'll be able to comment on that because I have not. See, I'm not aware of the filmmakers' politics, so I've just sampled one book, so I can't.
Well, the Association of Flowers.
But then I think that this kind of iconography is a little I would say regressive, because because it kind of succumbs to the idea of how we normatively construct gender. So I think it is. And like I said, I'm not aware of the filmmakers' politics, but just from just from this idea of kind of borrowing normative iconography to represent the woman, I think that's slightly regressive for me.
Okay, I think you're onto something there. Regressive or normative, or if we don't want to be pejorative about it, we could say it's a kind of classical reference. I mean, women have been associated with flowers throughout the history of civilization, haven't they? And specifically their anatomy with flowers.
And I heard this joke sometimes that men give women flowers, and then this is like a very normal like it's a romantic practice. But then what you actually say is that I'm interested in your reproductive organs. I'm interested in your vagina. When you actually give a woman a flower, right? So you're actually presenting her a vagina, basically.
Really, if I present a flower to my mother, that doesn't mean.
I'm saying.
See, iconography itself is a regressive construct. The very idea of embodying a certain idea or a category within an icon or an image or a symbol or a sign, as you would want to call it, considering Charles Peirce.
I started off by saying that
it's not regressive. The idea itself, the idea of iconography itself is regressive. Now, how you interpret a sign, how you posit a sign in the general framework of societal, what we call calculate social, within the societal framework, that can be regressive, normative, as you want to call it. As Tom said, let's not be pejorative about it. Let's think of it as a classical throwback, a throwback to a classical, icon. If you are aware of this lady called Asphodel Long, have you heard of Asphodel Long? She's a very famous feminist, and Asphodel chose the name Asphodel because it signifies, one of the most deadliest flowers in existence, the nightshade, and therefore she said in an interview. I think I'm loud enough. She said in an interview.
It's for recording.
So, Asphodel said in an interview, and I was witness to that, because her son, Joe Winter, lived in India for a long time, and he translated a lot of Jivanananda Das's poetry into Bangla, into English. And Asphodel said this, that it's a sort of a writing back when she was questioned about the choice of a name. And this was the very question that a very influential academic from Kolkata posited before her, that, flower, the flower as the woman, she said, see, I think it's a sort of a writing back. Now, this idea that when I present a flower to a woman, I'm saying that I'm only interested in her vagina is very pejorative.
But you are overreacting to this. She presented it as...
I am overreacting because it's pejorative. It's a joke. It's a very stupid joke. Anyway, so the thing is that this is the sort of anti-normativity or reaction against a sort of a liberal reading of sexuality that is contemporary, that is current in our contemporary culture. And as academics, I think we should shy away from it and instead question that very joke, isn't it?
But
so I think, yeah.
But if we think about the situation of the film in the 70s,
Mm-hmm.
and Barbara Hammer and other artists of that period belonging to a kind of lesbian feminist,
mm-hmm.
woman-centric culture, it's quite clear that this flower imagery belongs to that thrust and, in a way, essentializes women's bodies, women's sexuality, women's...
Yes, exactly. That's the point.
And is essentializing a pejorative concept according to constructivists, probably, but in itself, I mean, if we think of an artist like Georgia O'Keeffe, I don't know if you know the American painter, I mean, it's a very familiar and classical kind of association. So she's really indulging in it, essentially, excessively, beautifully. It's a kind of recurring poetry, visual poetry throughout the film. The daffodils are gorgeous, aren't they? Does Adrienne Rich use flower imagery? I mean, she also belonged to this culture, didn't she?
In some of her poems, she does, yes.
So it's really a familiar classical kind of association of women with the flower, and then she makes a beautiful visual poem about this, in addition to everything else she's doing. With the Silver Lake Life, the fact that immediately after the death, we cut to this beautiful orange flower, I think Neha is correct. We're reminded of the cycle of life. But again, it is also classic in the sense that flowers are associated with mourning and funerals, and we see the funeral crowded with flowers. And throughout the film, there is this use of the cacti, which is a kind of California flower in a way, a desert flower also. So I think this is a kind of classical, almost an unthinking classical connection as well, but different. It's not about gender this time, although you could argue that the cacti are phallic symbols. You might want to argue that. I wouldn't disagree with that. Yes? Where's the mic going?
I may be wrong, but last time when we saw these flowers in the two documentaries, we had two different images. One was basically colorful flowers, and the other one was basically we saw cactus. So what I feel that many times while showing the flowers, they were showing a circle, like it's moving continuously in a spherical way, and every time they showed that it was opening. It was opening and opening, and inside, like either it was empty or it was a hole. Either it was empty or it was a hole. Okay. So what I felt is that basically, like, sex can be divided into two parts. That usually, like, one is for reproduction, another one is for pleasure. Okay. And in most of the societies, or you can go for the major religions of the world, they take sex only that one that is used for reproduction. That is like acceptable, and the other one is usually regarded as a part of taboo or evil or whatever it is. Okay, that is not very much acceptable. So I feel that an emptiness they showed after the opening of the flowers, okay, or the hole, And on the other hand, where they were talking about this gay couple, they showed the cactus, and cactus usually grows in barren lands. I think both the flowers may represent, like if we try to think it up that way, that this woman, this lesbian relationship cannot give birth, like it is not, they cannot reproduce, and at the same time, the male-male gay relationship at the same time, they are also barren because they also cannot reproduce it.
Okay, I didn't perceive all of this going on, but I think it's probably all there. And it's interesting that the flowers with the hole that are very, very dynamic and connote pleasure. I wouldn't argue that the intent is to connote barrenness in either film, but I think that is literally true, what you're saying.
So they may not think about like saying that they are barren, but we can understand it in that way. So unconsciously, maybe it might be.
Okay, well, I'm glad we have an animator in the room and appreciated those dynamic, moving, twirling flowers. I mean, they're beautiful, and I'm glad you read so much into them. The other aspect of the cacti and the desert flowers is that they are public symbols rather than these private vaginal flowers. And they're about communal mourning as well. They're, I guess you could call them as standing in for collective grief or collective mourning. And this is completely classical in Western culture. I think you also have flowers in mourning and in funerals too, don't you? And so this connotation is there. So their expression of, I think, a kind of collective grief about this terrible death, this terrible epidemic. And for me also, there's a link to a film genre, to the melodrama. The genre in which very often flowers are used as symbols or figures of desire or consolation or fulfillment. We had a conversation about melodrama earlier in the seminar, in which the connotation of the term was pejorative. We say something is a melodrama, that can mean something negative, but I'm not using it negatively, I'm using it descriptively. I think as the queer community was going through this epidemic, it was very much in need of these works of bereavement and consolation and mourning, and the melodrama really fit that need. So there's so many of these films in the 80s and 90s that we could also call tearjerkers without being pejorative, which elicit grief, which elicit, but at the same time establish consolation. And very often in these films, grief is interwoven with sexuality and desire. And I think that's very particular to this series of films that were sparked by the AIDS epidemic, about death and dying, but also about desire. HIV is a sexually transmitted virus, and the connection with sexuality could be thought of as negative, but in these communal works, there's a kind of reaffirmation of sex positivity, isn't there? There's a kind of affirmation of sexuality in the midst of this desert of death. So that's one point I wanted to make about this film. Any other comment or question? I think the flowers in the Hammer film are very intimate fantasy objects or ritual objects. In Silver Lake Life, they are public. And I think this also brings out that there's a kind of dichotomy between public and private in both films. And I talk about it in the article that you read of mine for today about how documentaries of this period frequently use performance, but in different ways, to depict LGBT or queer private life, semi-public life, and public life. In Hammer's film, it's essentially about the private sphere, right? About the artist's love affairs with how many women? About 6 women, right? And the spaces that are evoked are the bedroom, the kitchen, the private garden. It's a very private universe in which this lovemaking takes place. The fact that she is filming it makes it public. So there's a contradiction going on there. What does it mean for an artist to be filming her own sexual acts? It's right now in the 21st century, the age of social media, we're familiar with sexting and sexual performances everywhere around us.
And there's a very interesting point in the film where she's shooting and there's a reflection of her and like on the door, and she's shooting her partner and there's a reflection of her on the door. So that's bringing yourself and the camera itself into the frame by doing that.
We're constantly reminded that this recording, this filming is going on and that it is first person. And the even more interesting shot, or another very interesting shot, is where she's lying back, being pleasured by her partner, holding the camera like this, filming her girlfriend. I think that's a very unusual shot. I'm sure it exists in gonzo porn or some of the other products that are circulating on the internet in the 21st century. Back then, it's pretty innovative to remember she's using celluloid and she's using a wind-up camera. So it's a pretty innovative shot. And what does it mean to film your own sex life? It is a kind of confirmation of that sexuality as constitutive of identity and personhood in a way, isn't it? The other film, Silver Lake Live, is much less about sexuality. Even though AIDS is a sexually transmitted virus, it's much more about relationships of the couple, of each of them with their caregivers and their community, with their blood family as well. So interestingly, the affirmation of sexuality in that film is very oblique. It's understated. It's much more about kinship, right? Both chosen kinship and blood kinship. It's a very intricately woven fresco of all of these chosen and inherited relationships. So when Jocelyn is filming his own sickness and then his death, in the background is all of this multi-directional relating going on. It's in the background of the canvas. It's not only really about his death, it's about his world. And of course, his lover, Mark, is, center stage of that world. So the public-private dichotomy is very complicated in both of those films. All the more so since the act of death, again, becomes public. It was shown on television. And it was filmed to be shown on television. It's a kind of what I call in my article a coming out, and all the more so in the Hammer film, it's coming out in both the sexual sense of the word and the performative social sense of the word. But Jocelyn and Massey don't go there except in the final image of the film. Do you remember what the final scene of the film is? It's a flashback to the 70s, remember? And the two men are doing a kind of dance together.
Yeah.
And it ends on a kiss. It's a very beautiful flashback. And this kiss is a little bit chaste, very sentimental and beautiful. And it sums up their entire sexual relationship. This is all we see in the film. It is interesting that this is in the past. This is a flashback. So both films are really also about time. You might argue that the Hammer film is about queer time. We really don't have a sense of the temporality or the sequence of all of these relationships. Did any of you feel that these girlfriends showed up in sequence, one after the other, or were they all in the landscape at the same time? Did she dump one, move on to the next, dump her, move on to the next? Or we don't know, it's ambiguous. They're all around, right?
All around.
So there's a kind of atemporality, or what you might want to call queer time going on. It's not about narrative or linear narrative. It's about simultaneity, if you like. And the fact that the sexuality of the couple in Silver Lake Life is affirmed through the flashback also creates an interesting play with temporality, doesn't it? They're both very complicated in this respect, and I think they echo each other in their use of time. Okay, let's come back to Butler. Butler's piece was written in response to certain misinterpretations of her book, Gender Trouble, that had come out. And she argued, you are misreading me. I mentioned drag for 5 paragraphs, and you think that my entire theory of gender performance is about drag or gender impersonation. It's not. That was just sort of like an example that I was using. And then she goes into a long argument that brings in psychoanalysis and speech act linguistics and all kinds of other theoretical regimes to explain her book, to elaborate on her book. But the important part that we should take out of it is that both the notion of performance and performativity, separate notions, can be interestingly applied to these autobiographical documentaries. They are full of performances, that is, theatrical self-expressions on the part of the two artists and their lovers, their family. They're always performing for the camera. And maybe this is because everyday life is so undocumented in this minority community that they are pushed to perform, to self-express on the camera. So that thing is going on. But the other thing that's going on is this kind of performativity action in which the very act of filming constructs a public identity for these individuals and by extension for all LGBT individuals. She did. I don't want you to get too confused about her theories of performativity. She normally associates performativity with heterosexual and mainstream gendered culture, doesn't she? And she basically argues that a kind of queer performativity is subverting and overturning the official regimes of performativity. And I think she's right about that. And I would argue that the autobiographical works play a special role in that kind of subversion of the inherited regimes, of coming out, of coming out. One of the other important things to take away from her article is that that sexuality, sex, and gender do not have what she calls truth regimes. They are performances. According to social scripts, according to the original that never really existed. And sex and gender both are the ingredients of these performances, and she argues that they're in dynamic relation to each other. They sort of mediate and inform or construct each other. One of the important definitions of queer is that gender is not corresponding to sexuality or to the inherited regimes of gender and sexuality. And I think that's a useful thing to come away from her piece with. Now, where she starts getting into psychoanalysis and its relation to depression and melancholia, I think she's going off on a tangent and she sort of leaves me behind. I'm not that interested in that, but I wanted you to, I wanted just to show you the two references she's making in that discussion and to the discussion she makes about drag, just to help fill in, flesh out the context in which she's writing in the early 90s. The early 90s connote the birth of queer theory, of queer politics, as well as this updating of gender theory around performativity and performance. So what I would like to do is just show you two clips. One of them comes from the film Paris is Burning, that everyone was talking about as she was writing this film, including herself, writing this essay, including herself, which is a documentary about African-American ball culture, these elaborate events that were staged repeatedly in New York City and elsewhere, in which performers played social roles that very often involved gender subversion. So we're going to look at just a clip from that. as the essence of gender, but as an instance in which the excessive performance of gender is theatricalized with very particular community operations within this ball culture, this African American context. So if you do want to look at this whole thing, you can easily find it on YouTube. Paris is Burning. Any question about that? Okay, the other point the other thing I want to show you is where she refers to public mourning around AIDS and how it is connected to depression or melancholia, and she calls it a kind of community expression of loss of masculinity, loss of the model of masculinity. And I think that's where she's going too far. But if you're not familiar with the quilt, the AIDS quilt that she refers to, I'm just going to show you a little clip of that. This history of public ritualized mourning using these visual materials, quilt connoting consolation and comforting and warmth, but bringing together the patches.
One day I was struck by a fever that wouldn't go down.
That connotes sewing together little pieces that connotes community at the same time. So the intensity of the public mourning that is sparked by this object was on everyone's consciousness during this decade, and she makes a very interesting comment on it, but as I said, I don't think that it holds up very far in terms of the Freudian analysis of it. What interests me more about her work is, obviously, as I wrote, was its application to documentary, queer documentary techniques. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. And if you think of these two films as narratives of performance moments, one after the other, they really start to make sense. They're very self-conscious filmmakers. For example, the scene that opens Silver Lake Live, do you remember that scene? What was that? Two men are lying in bed, trying to decide whether to look at the camera or look at the monitor. If they look at the monitor, they're not looking into the lens. And so it's a kind of back and forth, but on the screen, we see the couple. So it's like a performance of coupledom, of their relationship. But there's a kind of uncertainty to it in terms of its representation, whether they should be seeing their own representation or performing the representation. And in fact, they're doing both at the same time. And so it's a very complicated moment. Did you notice any other performances in the film that struck, or in either film that struck you as interesting? How did you like the natural healing scene in Silver Lake Live? The Mark invites the camera to accompany him to a natural healing session with a kind of faith healer, right? Invoker of spirits. So this is like a performance as well of the subject's submission to this healer. She is also performing, both for him and for the camera. There are multiple layers of performance going on in that scene. Excuse me. What is the impact of that scene? When they went through their hundreds of hours of footage, did you see the big box of the cartridges? Why did the posthumous editor pick that scene? It's a bit crazy, isn't it? It's sort of like a comic interlude in a way, even though we really empathize with this man in his desperation and his seeking out of every possible remedy, every possible treatment. In a film of intense emotion and sadness, it's almost like a clown-esque performance that interrupts the melancholy. In a way, it's an eruption of relief for us, don't you think? So the editor sort of picked this moment and used it in the film, even though it's futile, and we know somehow that it's not going to have any healing effect on the artist. It regulates the emotional, or it orchestrates a kind of emotional flow of the film in a way that is very engaging for us and provides, I guess, a lighter moment, a contradictorily lighter moment in this very heavy film about dying. Any other observation about moments in the film?
I think this comedy, this kind of heightens, at some level it also kind of heightens the emotion, like the emotional appeal of the film, in the sense that he's just desperate for like it kind of also highlights his desperation for a cure, or some kind of healing, some kind of recovery. So I think that comedy also underscores that aspect of it.
In the relationship, he also performs a kind of complementary role. Tom is stressed out, always speaking angrily into the camera. I want my lunch. I've been waiting in this car for an hour.
Yeah.
It's very tense, very stressful. Whereas Mark is the lighter one who's always dancing around, cracking jokes, expressing excess emotion, even after Tom's death. Kind of expression of emotion is excessive, isn't it?
Yeah. And do you wanted to, like, I am uncomfortable doing this, but would you link it to a certain kind of masculinity and femininity, like the masculine construct and the feminine construct of like Tom and
Well, according to the stereotypes, they are each performing kind of gendered role, aren't they? Tom as the cerebral one, the rational one, and him, Mark, as the affective one, the emotional one, the performing one.
And at the beginning of the film, they also say that when Mark says that it had to it took me a month of weeping and cajoling and trying to convince him that he fell in love with me, and he realized that he cannot love anyone and he only loves cinema. So then it was a month of begging and cajoling that he fell. Something like that he said.
That was a very interesting dynamic in their relationship. And in the flashback, where we see him reading on the roof in the snow, that is also a great performance moment of excess, isn't it?
To some extent, some stereotypification may be there, but we also see that the one who is more rational is also the caregiver. Usually in gender stereotypes, the female or the feminine one is the caregiver. But here we don't see it.
But
I think we see more of an androgynous.
But I don't recall Tom ever doing it. I think because for me this was an interesting dynamic that he just it was Mark taking care of Tom more than the other way around, even though both of them had AIDS. I don't recall Tom taking on the caregivers. I may be wrong though.
No, I think you're right. That is the basic pattern. Tom is more advanced in the illness than Mark. So there's that sort of almost natural dynamic. Anyone else? Okay, let me tell you what we're showing at 4 o'clock. 2 films, an Indian film and a Canadian film. The Indian film is from the same approximate period, the end of the 90s, called Summer in My Veins rather, by Nishit Saran, who was a Delhi-based filmmaker who died very young. So we'll look at his both are autobiographical works. We'll look at his autobiographical work. And then we'll look at the Canadian film called Yapping Out Loud, which is a kind of film version of a theater performance, a public performance, monologue by Mira Soleil Ross, which brings into question, again, bad girl, feminism, gender performance, drag, transsexual identities, and I suppose you could say good girl feminism as well. It's a very interesting hybrid, and so I hope you will enjoy that, and we'll see you at 4 o'clock, all right?
Thank you.